Hello, everyone. We hope you're having a fantastic day and a great time at WriteHive 2024, where we're writing the future we need for our fifth consecutive year. I'm Jesse Pohlman. I'm a moderator for WriteHive, and I have the honor of hosting today's panel, War and Long-Term Effects in Fiction. As far as my background goes, I'm a former history and ELA teacher from New York City and other school districts, and a sci-fi fantasy author. If you see me looking down and away from the camera, it's probably me scribbling notes to possibly tie back in later. You may also see my cat hop on my desk and possibly need to be relocated if she gets, well, catty with me. At 5 years of age, WriteHive has built up a huge repository of information and prior events. If you want more panels similar to this topic, you can check out Writing Historical Fiction from our 2021 conference, Research 101, a proper deep dive from our 2021 conference, and Geography and World Building from our 2022 conference. One last note, if you're in our Discord chat, feel free to leave any questions and our panelists will do their best to answer them. Without further ado, it's time for our panelists It's time for our panelists to introduce themselves in our first question. Please introduce yourself, tell us briefly where people can find you, and let us know a bit about your background on warfare and its applications in fiction. Who would like to go first?
I'll go first.
Sure.
So my name is MultiMind, and also you can find me anywhere on the internet under MultiMind Publishings, especially at multimindpublishing.com or MultiMind Publishing on Instagram, as well as other social medias. But pretty much my background in warfare and as well as its application in fiction is that I am a researcher and also for uh, worldwide social issues and humanitarian issues, and this does include warfare, genocide, and things of that nature from history up to now, as well as my applications in fiction. I write it.
Cool. I can jump in next. So my name's Jonathan Weiss. You can find me on the internet, jonathanweiss.com.au, or you can find me on Instagram. I think there's a Twitter account that I don't look at much as well. I'm a science fantasy author from Australia. As far as my background goes, it's not as kind of involved as MultiMind's there. I've got a degree in journalism and consume a lot of media and podcasts and all that. So I like to keep informed on the current events and everything that's been happening in the past. As for how I apply it in fiction, a lot of my works are set in a bit of a post-apocalyptic fantasy world, but that still leverages a lot of kind of doctrines and philosophies and outcomes that you see in warfare and the effects of it as well.
Hi, my name is Semke Marteens. I am a scientist by day and also a mom by day. And I am a science fiction and fantasy writer by night. So I wrote several novels, though none of them are published as yet. But some of my flash fiction you can find on my Instagram account. So my background when it comes to war is mostly from my personal experience, which is the experience during the Croatian War of Independence. So I come from Croatia, and Croatian War of Independence started in 1990 when I was 3 years old, and it ended in 1995 when I was 8. So basically, some of my earliest childhood memories are basically memories of wartime and memories of recovery from the wartime. So this is mostly my experience when it comes to war.
Okay, that leaves me. My name is Liam Quane, and I'm a author and filmmaker from the UK. As far as my background goes, I am just very confident with my opinions. That's what I have. I don't have any like degrees regarding like actual wartime research or like humanities or anything that covers human experience, but I think with how much fiction is plays a part with molding the human experience, I feel like I'm capable to go into a deep dive especially when it comes to the effect in fiction and the effect that fiction has on people. Yep. So if you want to find me, you can find me on Your grandma's Facebook and Instagram under my name, and another website called Vero, which is it's similar to Instagram, but it's also is built around filmmaking and novel writing, and that's the main site I use.
Alrighty, so this takes us to our first question. How can an author respectfully capture the consensus building, mobilization, and the frequent dehumanization that goes into the launching of a war? And we're going to keep the same order going through.
All right. So the way an author can respectfully capture the consensus building, mobilization, and the frequent dehumanization that goes into the launching of war is research. A lot of people, fortunately, have personalized war experiences, but in other people who have privileges to not ever have to experience a war, for example, I'm American. Therefore, I don't know what it's like to have my country invaded, but I'm a Black American. So I actually kind of already do. So, because of all the different things that are war-like, but are not necessarily wars. For example, dealing with church bombings or anti-Black targeted mass shootings, or even like what happened with Move Africa in the 1980s, where a helicopter dropped a bomb on a Black neighborhood because they thought that was the most humane thing to do. Yay. So how you can respectfully deal with all the things that have happened with war, research and remember those are people. Even if your story is just toasters and broomsticks fighting each other, oh, you still have to humanize it enough for the human reader to actually understand that, oh, this is a war. And the best way to do that is actually researching the human side of war, because all those numbers of the dead are an actual living, breathing person who had their feelings and everything. And plus, they didn't just go wake up one day and say, I'm going to start a war. They had to build up to the moment, from society having to change to plights and issues. For me, I personally go with documentaries. I use resources such as the Dangerous Speech Project, as well as looking at places that already talk about the humanitarian side of war, such as Human Rights Watch, who has an Instagram and a website.
Yeah, nice. No, it's yeah, comprehensive. All right. I'll see if I can give an answer to rival that. Doing it respectfully is always going to be hard. I think, as MultiMind said, a lot of research. I think the one thing to keep in mind as well is that, especially for the consensus building for, let's say, a home population that's looking to start a war, it's not something that happens immediately. Like, your government of the day doesn't come out and say, "We're doing a war. How good's that, people?" It's a slow process. It happens in lots of different little bits and pieces, and often it's the media within that country that's complicit, whether it is state run or not. It's all these, you'll see it in opinion pieces that are given in the day. You'll see it in the way that issues are reported, which type of bias that they're given there as well. So, you can go back to just about any conflict throughout history and look at the newspapers at the time, and you'll see this really distinct style of reporting that's given that really kind of lends a strength, so to speak, to the home country that the reporting's coming from, to say, yeah, we're up for war, we're ready to go, kind of thing. Because it's very rare, at least in the kind of opening phases of a conflict, for the home media to be dissuasive to the population. I mean, if you go back to the early 2000s and you look at the media reactions to the Dixie Chicks saying, "I don't think we should invade the Middle East," and they just got their careers ended because, yeah, everyone thought they should, apparently. But yeah, it's just those little bits and pieces.
And also comics and media at the time as well, not just the news, because not everybody watched news, but people would sneak in their stuff at the same time, like SNL also, when they made fun of Al
Yeah,
Jazeera.
exactly. Yeah.
And the government didn't tell them to do that. The writers thought this was a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was actually gonna tap onto there. Remember that everybody also has an agenda, not just as groups, but as individual human beings. We as a species we're an animal. and we cannot cope with modern warfare because it's not spontaneous enough. So a good way of actually observing and formulating your story to get conflict like set out in the way you want them to is to zoom out from the world and make it a tiny ball in your head, and then rotate it where to move between countries and groups, and remember that the people you are thinking about regarding the conflict are not real. So you can approach them through this like skeletal structure and process where you put all your pieces in place, and then once that's done, then you can bring in all the empathy and all the focus on those individuals in order to flesh them out as real people. And a good way to do that is to not look at it from a place of, well, not really a place of judgment, but remember that humanity's very stupid. So it's a good way of actually. I know this sounds really bad, but one of my techniques is to belittle, and I don't mean belittle real life individuals or not like that. I mean belittle my characters, because it's easier for me then to empathize with them, because I'm, you can belittle yourself easily. So a good way to actually structure a sensitive story and focus on like the dehumanization aspect of war is to dehumanize the characters yourself, because then you are learning on the go exactly how propaganda works, how like military a military like communication force actually operates. It sees itself as bigger, it sees itself as important. So you can, as a creator, do that whilst you're making your project. Not outside of making your project, because then you become an egomaniacal lunatic. But other than that, there's no real sensitive way to go about it, especially when you have a story with a beginning, middle, and end, because then you will side somewhere, and if it's based on real life conflict, then you will belittle somebody and get somebody angry who wasn't on the victorious side of your story, if that makes sense.
I think another way of also remembering is when it comes to writing about wars, everybody thinks they're the hero of their own story. Everyone thinks they're the hero of their own story, including the villain. So, and dehumanization stuff, oh, that's really easy. Just look at media today, especially if a person has privileges and stuff, then that means they will need to do extra homework, because there's a lot in dog whistling and implies, and already biases has already been built into your head. So that's kind of, you get to see pretty much how it works in motion, as well as learning how to do like media critical thinking and media literacy. All that super helps.
All right.
It's from a human to a thing to get rid of.
When it comes to respectfully capturing the war and the wartime experience and the build-up to war, this is actually, I think, a very, very, very difficult thing to do, because the whole, idea of something being respectful comes from our own personal background. So if we're coming from a certain culture, if we're coming from a certain part of the world, we might have an entirely different idea of what is considered respectful, as opposed to a different group of individuals, maybe coming from a different part of the world, or in science fiction, aliens like coming from an entirely different world. And I think this is actually maybe well mentioned, well described in a book that is called Forever War. So Forever War is actually a book written by Joe Haldeman, and he actually participated in Vietnam War. And the interesting thing is, when I was reading that book, I immediately felt the connection, as if this is someone who truly has experienced a wartime and the wartime effects, and has understood this deep disconnect between different cultures and what we're communicating and how we're communicating it, which ultimately leads to a certain conflict. So I do think it is very, very difficult to be, respectful when we're talking about war. However, there are some things which we can do. And like MultiMind mentioned, I think number one is research, of course. So you need to do a lot of research, read about history of war. And if you can talk to people who have personal experience with war coming from different backgrounds, that will help you open up your mind to all of the different kinds of situation, different kind of buildups that can be present when it comes to war, because there is not always just one scenario how war happens. Sometimes it's one sort of cultural, one sort of way of life as opposed to a different way of life. And then you have two strong civilizations clashing about it, which one should be the one to go forward. Sometimes it's one nation falling down into smaller nations. So you kind of have like this country divorce situation. Sometimes it's one country dispute over a territory with another country. So there are many, many different ways how actually war can occur and why war can occur. And maybe, also on the surface, the reason why is at the same time not the true reason why certain group of politicians or people or power has started it. So to research all of the aspects of this sort of event is important. And I think when we're talking about war, in order to come as close to being respectful as possible, I think what one would need to do is show different aspects of it, like show how something like war has affected different individuals. And I think one good example from fiction in order how to do it is from Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, like the most famous book about war ever written. And it's I think it's so famous for a reason, and it's because it's showing many different individuals having a different experience of war and having different reactions to war. And it kind of shows you characters from both sides and their motivations. So what it comes down to is how basically war affects and war buildup affects civilization, as opposed to a person on a personal level, as opposed to, like a small community. And the more you go into like fine-tuning this and understanding this story to connect on these many different levels, the closer you're going to get to showing, what actually happens in some sort of war situation and build up to war in a respectful way.
So, we've talked about how these are people, how the consensus building is not immediate, it takes time, and how modern warfare is not spontaneous, so it's harder for people to understand the build up to that. One thing that's often left out or only touched on a little bit in fiction is the everyday experience of a war. How does an ongoing war deliver everyday impacts to people both on the front lines and away from them? In other words, if you're seeing it face to face, if it's something that's right there in front of you versus something maybe you're in the back lines, you're a worker doing something that maybe helps the war effort or something like that. How does a war feed into those issues?
It really does vary up, because obviously seeing a drone deliver death directly to your doorstep is going to feel way different from just reading about it on the TV or hearing about it. because it also depends, for example, on the characters, their relation to the war. If they're on the front line, maybe the person was very rah, go war, then they wound up on the front line and found out it's nothing like the video games. Or maybe the person didn't even want to go, but they have to because it's either this or not having money for college. Everybody has a reason for why they're there. Some people are there because they genuinely want to be feeling passionate, and others is because they literally had no other choice. And that's in terms of the front lines of how like a person would have to kind of do their research on how a frontline war would work. So that means learning things like militaristic terms, or how does the day in the life of a soldier in any old place. They are free to do their research there. Because there is downtime, there's uptime. People do get to talk to their families, but not all the time. And also sometimes they have to watch what they say. But also being away from the front line, because there's always that psychic war kind of going on, that psychological war going on. These are the bad guys. This is how we did. This is how we didn't do, and so on and so forth. And how it influences people in how they treat each other and stuff. Some people might be pro-war effort. Some people might think the war is ridiculous because they can't afford something and or they don't have access to something. They went, well, I don't never met any of these people who are bombing. Why are we doing this? It's going to be very a lot of moving parts. And also you may have your government trying to drum up morale, because if the people in the nation has low morale about it, the war may not necessarily go on, because also politicians might want to keep their seat, but also that's a politician, not necessarily a person like royalty or a king. But even then they still got to watch for their head, because somebody might be ready to lop it off. Also, there's the idea of just there's a lot of moving parts, but definitely it's best to kind of like get the skeletal framework of what is war about, who would be the players of it, who are the nations about it. Like I said, even if it's just the toasters versus the broomsticks and stuff, there still got to be something about the more distance you have from a war. And sometimes even if someone's completely, they don't care for war, they don't look at war media and stuff, it still affects their lives in weird ways, such as the products they used to having might be thinner, might be a different style or type, or it just simply isn't there anymore. Price goes up, price goes down. There's all sorts of ways it can affect in both seen and unseen ways.
Yeah, and just playing off your last point there, I was actually going to make a point of like in a war, the nature of a country's economy and all their logistics really changes starkly to suddenly be re-geared for another purpose entirely. Like you'll see a lot more people and a lot more jobs that didn't exist before. Munitions factories, for instance, need to be started and run at full tilt, or someone has to be making the tools of war. Someone needs to be able to get that stuff to the front lines. And I guess we'll touch more on this in the post-war part, but like you'll see a lot of changes in the social fabric. Like in World War II, all of a sudden, women could actually have jobs. They actually had jobs in these factories, and they came with varying degrees of danger due to the chemicals and products they were creating. But when the war ended, suddenly they were getting kicked out of the factories again as the men came home, and kind of society started to resume its quote unquote natural order. So yeah, I'd say looking at the way that not only the people are changed, but the society around them is changed, and the way that they need to suddenly cater almost all their efforts to the matters of warfare.
Yeah, yes and no. Because also, like, I mean, because even during then, it was still an idea of, oh, the enemy. Because somebody who had a German last name could probably get still a job at that factory. But if their last name was, Shinoda, which is a Japanese last name, you weren't getting anything. You were suspected as a spy, even though have any spies, but Germany had tons of them here. But definitely bias was always going to play a role, and not only that, but also it wasn't still very balanced, because a Black person still couldn't probably get that really savory munition job, and they could still fight over in World War II, come back and get lynched in their own service uniform, because
and look,
you get for freedom.
Yeah,
so,
and like, I'm sorry.
Remember the things like that. So it's a lot of moving parts of.
Yeah, and like,
well,
I guess you'd see that discrimination kind of a lot in the ranks of the soldiers too. I mean, Australia has a pretty atrocious record of that too. Like, Aboriginal Australians were either recruited or even conscripted to fight in the army, and then they weren't recognized. They were put in their own individual units. Like I think some of the World War II veterans weren't even recognized until about 1997. It's ridiculous. Sorry, go on there.
So there pretty much can be also, that can also show a dynamic within war, but also to show the difference between what propaganda will say, which is we're here for everybody and everyone will do well, to showing the reality of not really, we're only here to help ourselves. Or some people will have a lot of things, but we're still going to keep things the way they are, which also can show a idea of disillusionment in like what you're writing and stuff. Because I mean, white folks during World War II and with wars afterwards, even up to now, would go, yes, this is great. But people who were constantly getting the shaft usually tend to see straight through it because they already saw what was happening beforehand, duringhand, and they could pretty much guess what's going to happen afterhand. So that can show different dynamics. Basically, when it comes to war, dynamics are in play.
I think when it comes to like the relative way of being for anybody like on the front lines, anybody in a base in another country or whatever, one of the things that they lack is choice. But according to some statements made by various soldiers over the years, that is actually a comfort, the lack of choice. There's a scene from the movie The Hurt Locker where I know it's dressed up as a realistic war film, but it's not. It's very like a lot of it just isn't realistic in the slightest. But the one part that like really affected certain soldiers was the bit in the grocery store where the soldier's back home and he's just staring at like the cereal aisle, and he just cannot make a choice. And that's kind of the thing that when people are in like, as they say, enemy territory or whatever, or the in this, let's just call it a commune. When they're in a commune, they don't choose anything for themselves really. They wear the clothes they're told to wear. They eat the meals they're given. All a lot of them sign up for very similar agendas, and they all answer to the same people, and that goes on for years. So it kind of molds a new person in a way when they're there, because it's communism. Militarism is just communism when it comes down to it, because it's all state welfare, state funded, that type of thing. It's just the communism that people prefer. I'm not a communist. I'm not a socialist. I am left wing.
I'm a socialist.
Yeah, I'm a slightly different thing, but I like socialists. I like communists. Well, I don't want like my cause to be made by government, if that makes sense. That's how far I go. But when it comes to like the attitude of these factions and what they're fighting, the people further back who don't really go out and see much action, they are still in danger to a point, but they're kind of the reverse, where the people on the front lines are always in danger and have no choice, but the people behind have all the choices and have a fraction of the danger. So it's kind of this strange hierarchy of two groups split together, but they all function in these small communities. So that becomes like a world for them to exist in, like a self-sustained, gated off, fenced off area where they come and go every day, like it's a video game, like a hub, and that affects their lives there and their lives back home, which is why it's apparently very difficult for some soldiers to like reintegrate back into society, because they're out of that hub, they're out of that world, and it's why they seek it when they come back. So it's why a lot of veterans meet up in like veterans clubs and shooting clubs. Like it's why sports shooting quite big. We'll look at the American sniper guy. Like he was killed by somebody who was at a shooting club who had PTSD, who was trying to help, but like he sought out these people to help them. Like that was because that's what he thought he was doing over there. Like I know his memoir kind of come across as psychopathic, but I think that was more I don't think he was really in control of that. I think he was asked to like fluff things up to sell it to a broader audience looking for more Call of Duty style stories, that's psychopathic to me, but I don't think it was him. I don't think he was like not multiple murderer, but I also don't think he had that control, because going back to it, soldiers don't really have that control. They do, like, a lot of soldiers do need to be told what to do because they find comfort in that way of being.
Kind of reminds me of Muse's song Psycho, which I really, really like because it encapsulates the idea of like what it feels like to go through basic training. For me, because of my family tree, like my grandfather was in World War II, my uncles were in Vietnam, Korea, my sister participated in Afghanistan, where they nicknamed the Middle East the sandbox. So I have kind of the different experiences of all of that. And whereas on my dad's side of the family, who's from Jamaica and stuff, where they came through the Windrush because of the British, of them fighting back against the British Crown in the 1960s or so. So
Thank you for doing that, by the way.
yeah, so
Yeah, genuinely.
all that
I'm
kind of,
all for that.
yeah, all that experiences and stuff showed me like how it looks on the ground level. And PTSD is extremely real. One thing I noticed that when it comes to war, it's not fun, it's not pretty, it is hell, and it leaves the hell inside your head as well, because a lot of these folks are not automaton soldiers. That's why I really like the Muse song Psycho, because of how it really encapsulates the emotional and psychological impact of it. But definitely it's just that they're not born, no one's really a born killer. They have to be built to be one and stuff. And then usually once the war is over, they kind of just get shipped back. And it's this propaganda of, hooray, we love our soldiers, we love the people who fought for us, but not really, because outside of the little sticker you get, they kind of abandon you because your job is done and you didn't get shipped. You got shipped back breathing, but it would have been better if you got shipped back in the box so we could just tell everybody how awesome you are and abandon you all the same. That is a dynamic that plays very commonly and stuff that also makes people go from being in a war to becoming an extremely anti-war because they're going, wait a minute, I just got used as a toy soldier. And that
it's like they're getting lied to, like they come back and, people don't really want them to tell the story properly, because then they kind of at home other people would need to grapple with the reality of what's actually been done effectively in the name of their country. And they just don't want soldiers to talk about it.
And also how difficult it is for veterans to even be able to have a society that actually understands them. Because, I mean, it's not great when you have on Veterans Day some soldier who actually has a sign out that says, please no fireworks. But people want to light fireworks to celebrate what they've done. But the fireworks triggers that person into thinking they're back on the war zone. So that's a dynamic that can play also in the book about how people, even if they think they're meaning the best, that's not always how it always plays out. Because they were told that's how you celebrate, even though the best way to celebrate a veteran is to shove them in a lot of therapy.
So, everyday experience of war. I think a lot has been said already about it. Maybe my own little contribution to this would be that, this whole everyday experience, there are so many aspects of it which are oftentimes not well captured in fiction, because mostly fiction looks at the exciting parts, the parts that would be kind of like drum up the heartbeat of the reader, but there are then also these other aspects, like for instance, when you're far away from enemy lines. And from my own personal experience, I was a child at the time, so I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't understand who was fighting, but there was this whole feeling of like there is something going on. You're unsafe, and this feeling of being unsafe is something that continued from early in the morning up to the late evening. And even though I was a very small child at the time, I was aware of it, and I was very much aware of it. So for me personally, some of the aspects which are oftentimes not captured in fiction are these, the general feeling of something going on, even when it's a downtime, when, there are no guns firing, when there are no bombs and, no sirens announcing the attacks and so on. Even then, as a child, I would frequently, for instance, have nightmares, and those nightmares would go on every single night. And those would be very, very bloody nightmares, something that I personally didn't even see, but I was aware of it happening. I heard the news, I saw the news, even though my parents were very much trying to protect me, I was aware of the situation. So every single night I would go to sleep, and it would not be a peaceful sleep. It would be these very, very disturbing nightmares frequenting me every night. And then, there are these other aspects connected to it. For instance, like religion. Religion was a very, very big part of my childhood, because when there is this general feeling of, something going on and you being unsafe, you're looking for places of safety, you're looking for hope, you're looking for some sort of higher protection, because you're aware of the fact that even your parents sometimes cannot protect you. And then there are these other, like bits and pieces. So for instance, even for me, I do not remember like every single day-to-day event that was going on, but there are some events which stuck really, really strong in my memory. And some of them were not even, these very exciting moments, but they were very personal and very touching moments. For instance, the first time my father was drafted to go into the war, I was a very small child, and we already moved out. We moved out from our home because our home was very close to a military base and a potential target of the airstrikes. So we were living in this sort of like one small basement and sleeping there. And then my father was drafted, and I remember clearly getting up very, very early, earlier than my brothers and my brother and sister and my mother, and saw my father dressing for going into the war. I saw him in the uniform. And then, this memory stuck so much in my mind, because I realized that he's going out into the danger, and that this may be the last moment that I see my father. And this is something that was very, very, very strong memory for me. And for, for anyone, any character in fiction, there are moments like this in war which are really, really significant for them and for their development, even though there might not be very, very, flashy and, very exciting on the outside, but they're very, very significant for the characters going through it. And then, there are these other aspects like hunger and so on. And I think it's very well captured, for instance, in Suzanne Collins' Hunger Games.
Alrighty, so we've talked about, well, I can't see my notes because my cat is sitting on them, but we've talked about the dynamics of everyday impacts. We've talked about how there's a routine to the warfare that you're sort of put into, because it sort of dehumanizes the soldier, and it even dehumanizes the worker on the back lines to be part of this wartime economy that's a different world than the pre-war, and probably a different world than the post-war. I want to talk for a minute about the dynamics between two countries, and I should have also added in the question entities at war, and how, when you're writing fiction, how the dynamics between these two entities, be they countries or a country and an organization, or even two organizations at war, how that impacts the story. So in other words, are they equal nations in conflicts versus multiple nations at odds versus an oppressed and an oppressor within an entity or within two different entities? How do we write that? How do we transform that from something based in reality to something a little more fictional? How do we do that?
Are we doing the dynamics between the two countries at war in fiction question? I'm sorry, I know your cat's blocking your notes.
Yes, that is what we are doing.
Okay. That one is in a way, I almost want to say, oh, that's really easy because you just got to pay attention to what's happening now. But definitely, it's just that because it will play a lot how UK and US went at odds with each other to make the US a country and stuff is different from now about how US and UK handles things like Cambodia. Even now, when we're dealing with the issues of Israel versus Palestine and stuff, Israel versus Palestine, Ukraine versus Russia, it's like it's a lot of the conflicts. It varies up in also that it sometimes it may look like two nations might be fighting, but actually there might be some meddling powers behind it that might be hiding in the background, which has happened a lot for a lot of nations, especially developing nations, and that can play a role as well, especially also oppressed versus oppressor, because of course the oppressor sometimes likes to paint themselves as, no, we're actually the oppressed one. Like, oh my God, we're such nice people. And then these crazy people wanted to come and kill us. What? That is usually kind of how it's also painted. So it really varies up because also multiple national conflicts and stuff. Like it really varies up. But yeah, just doing your homework and seeing kind of how wars played out in the past for other nations, especially nations that don't always get shine and stuff, such as nations in Southeast Asia, every single nation in Africa and stuff in South America, whole 9 yards. And also seeing how that worked and weaved into itself. Documentaries are a big yes to this. That and also, like I said, Human Rights Watch, and also websites such as like for example, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, because they track also genocide around the world. People who basically can break down the mechanics of how things get this way, and also how if the U.S. and UK starts to have a problem with each other versus if it's U.S. versus Afghanistan, where it's one country with a bunch of money and a bunch of might versus another nation with its own history, lives, people, politics, and da 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 da.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of war ends up being asymmetrical. You'll have no two sides that are equally matched in power or might, and generally, if they are equally matched, they're going to destroy each other anyway. But yeah, you'll have countries attempting to invade supposedly weaker countries, but then the problem they'll run into is just the sheer geographical problems of trying to get all their troops into one place, trying to get the materials into one place, trying to know the lay of the land. I mean, a lot of times Afghanistan gets called the sorry,
invading Russia in the wintertime, how they managed to win against the Germans, because everybody now jokes. It was like, oh, they invaded Russia in the wintertime.
I mean, yeah, I remember like hearing that a lot. I read into that a little bit more, and like, you know, things like Napoleon, for instance, like he invaded effectively in the summer. It's just by the time he got there, it was winter. So yeah, it's just that geographical thing where you're just spending so long to try and get somewhere that you know the morale of your troops is worn down and stuff, right?
Yeah, not only that, but also the idea of just because they may have a smaller number doesn't mean they don't have a smaller will to fight, because
yeah,
that, for example, with Ukraine and stuff, they kind of just said, they was like, we feel so sorry for the Russian soldiers because you're gonna die here. And it's just
yeah,
and that's what it was. But definitely
it's a different thing to fight for.
well, yeah. And also
I
one
was
thing, the oppressed will usually have more of a psychological will. They know what they're fighting for example, and stuff, versus dealing with the let me see, the oppressed usually has a lot more will because they know exactly what they're fighting for, versus the oppressor, it's just, well, I can't go to the theme park in the summer and stuff, and so on and so forth, because
someone just said go out there and shoot that guy, right?
bingo. Whereas the other person,
Yeah.
they're like, this is my home, this is my family, this is my culture. If you want to take it, it will be over my dead
you got your
body.
back against the wall, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even Putin himself, I remember him saying he was watching a rat and he cornered it, and he went, and that's when he came up the phrase, well, even a scared rat will jump. Even though the rat, he was like, I'm a human. The rat's smaller than me, but it was willing to give up its entire life just to be like, hey, I won't go down easy.
It's got no other options effectively.
Bingo. And I mean, it also shows like it doesn't have to be big war and stuff where there's thunder and lightning. It can be even small conflicts, because that's how it was for the civil rights movements civil rights movement, abolitionist movement, Black Lives Matter movement, where it's because for me, I see it for a lot of different cultural changes because, yeah, I'm a Black American. Because I do have to, I do as a researcher, as a librarian, talk to folks around the world and stuff. And it's interesting when they talk to, say, a white American about like fighting for freedom. And I'm sitting here going, ooh, it's weird. But I just go, once you start to see what once you start to deal with some of the problems, there's like you could die, and it's like awesome, make a cool like statue after me, and that can sometimes chill your oppressor because they'll go, oh boy, I wasn't willing to fight this hard. So it's all dynamics. It's all the dynamics.
Yeah, has anybody ever heard of the TV show The Wild Thornberrys?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I
Can't wait to see how
tend
this
to,
comes relevant.
yeah, I like to assign characters from that I know to different countries when I'm describing like how they behave, not in a book, but in my research and stuff like that. So when I'm talking about Western powers, England is the old delusional patriarch who, whenever their wild children mention an idea, they go, "Oh, smashing," and then just run behind them. And America's Donnie, the one who goes and runs ahead with trying to cause trouble. No offense to America, your governments do have a tendency to do first and ask no questions later.
Oh yeah, I know. I mean, like
However,
I said, Black American, this affects my family history.
yeah.
At least it's Thornsberry and not Hitalia, because I mean, Hitalia, that literally was the premise of it, Hitalia. But it
Yeah,
reminds me
yeah.
also of like Animaniacs when they would do the characterize all the different countries. That's how I wound up learning this stuff as a kid.
Yeah, it's a very useful tool to to help compartmentalize like entire regions into the, because again you're not going to be able to count every head. You're not going to be able to make a book with entire populations still under caste list or whatever. So with that, I also my book my debut novel is called Road to Juno, and it is set after a post non-nuclear World War III, in which the result of the European Union breaking up, which was triggered by Brexit, that ended up leaving European countries a bit defenseless, and then the three main superpowers of the world, China, Russia, and America, all started to invade the closest around them in order to sink themselves into that land and then eventually start quelling riots, eventually start quelling protests, and then started taking over the countries each one by one. And then as they were getting closer to the middle of the world, they converged on each other and a full-scale conflict broke out for the land. That is like the story I wrote, the premise that on which the novel was based, and a way that was useful to me. The way that I ended up framing the story was to have a character start off small and go bigger, and grow powerful and powerful and powerful. So in the first few chapters, the main character is a single individual living in America, and that character is relaying to the audience what has happened in the country, what's went on, this is how our world become this one. And then over the course of the story, as the character gets more powerful and becomes what is essentially a super genius god loon man, egotistical world watcher, that they can fly through space, they can time travel, they can do they have this myriad of powers that reshapes the way they talk to the audience. So then they start breaking up and building out the countries and actually explaining the relationships between the countries that they had missed before they grew in their power. So they start pointing out things that they were taught that they realized later on was propaganda, and it does it in a way to I did this technique in order to actually change perspectives and have it or different countries talked about in a relatively realistic way. It sounds stupid, but it's no different from somebody getting internet access who's not had it really in their mind. So it's like they listened to what they were told in there. They knew everything, and then they find out all the truth of how the conflict's broken out, a breakout, and they actually visit sites of the conflict. They actually go back in time to the war, and they meet people on the ground, and they see the people around the different all the different townspeople in the countries, and then they're on an educational journey. But it was a technique employed in order to help establish the relationships between these different countries, both as allies and enemies. I'm done, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, that's pretty much. I mean, the dynamics, it varies up honestly, depending on the people fighting, but also the nations and stuff, because every country has diverse citizenships, even the nations that think they don't. But that pretty much, it's like it depends on a lot of things, honestly, and also the psychological impact of the people as well, because also neutral nations exist as well, and sometimes they get dragged into the quarrel as well.
For some reason I've got 1984 vibes. I don't know why. It's the nature of the endless war, I guess. Anyway, our next question.
Yeah.
I read 1984. It wasn't. I'm surprised that book got published. The dystopian part, A1. Everything else, oh my god, it was not great.
Well,
Not right women or anyone else.
so okay, we've gotten through the war. The war's over, or at least contained. How can post-war recovery and its lingering effects be portrayed in fiction? In other words, the war's over. Now we have to do the next thing. We have to fight the peace, for lack of a better term. How do we do that?
Resentment, because it's war. Not everybody's gonna be happy. The winners are the winners, or they think they're the winners. Some people are the losers and not happy about it, or some people did win, but they still feel like a loser at the end of it all. Once the dust is settled, a lot of people they're grieving, they're finding out somebody they thought survived didn't survive, and also there's a lot of like mixed knowledge and stuff. It's really the lingering effects and stuff can be best summed up into as resentment as against the folks who they went to war for, against a government that sent them off, so on and so forth. I mean, there's a video of a soldier that was yelling at, I believe, somebody from the Bush administration, if not Bush himself. And he was like, I was sent to war in 2003. Why are we doing this? So on and so forth, and everything in between. So basically, basically resentment. It's not happy. It gets depicted in movies and video games and stuff. That the end of war, it's everybody's happy and they all do the cool superhero A-line walkthrough, but it's not how it really works and stuff, because there's that trauma, there's living with the trauma, there's the people at home who they're happy the war is over. Hopefully they can get some peace. It's a person who's coming back home hoping that now they can get some peace, but find out they have brought way back more from war than just a couple medals, but more like trauma and things of that nature that they have no idea what's happening to them. It's pretty common for folks to go off a happy, awesome person and come back really just haunted in their head. And that can play a lot of roles in fiction and stuff. And plus the propaganda machine, it just sometimes the scales fall from the eyes where it's like, well, we got what we got. So yeah. And just are very discarding, if anything. Or even if they lose, they'll say, we did great.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, exactly. I love sending that gift to my friends as well. Oh man. Well, yeah, I was gonna say, like, after war is supposedly over, I was gonna say a good way to portray it is just how long it takes for soldiers to get home, up until probably like I'd say even after World War II, once we actually had proper airplanes up and running to ferry people back and forth across the world. Like, it would take months, if not years, to get soldiers back from the front lines and back to where they'd been recruited or conscripted from. Like, after the end of World War II, like it took people 2 or 3 years to get home. And you also had the problem after World War II. Spanish flu had broken out. So, I think once the war's over, it's not necessarily over. It takes so long just to wind back all the stuff with the economy that we were talking about earlier, all the, propaganda. You need to actually stop running that, because the propaganda serves no purpose now. You can't keep your population riled up and ready for a fight, because there's no fight left to fight, at least, or, even the supposed winner of the war, they just won't have the resources or the will to continue fighting a war at that point too. So yeah, send your characters, if they're coming back from the front line, on a literal odyssey. I mean, that's what happened to Odysseus, right? He came back from the war and it took him 20 years at sea to figure out how to get home, which, isn't too far from the truth probably in those days of how long it took to get back to where you'd come from.
And also the idea of when they come back, what they come back to. I mean, I remember when my sister came back from war and how it was not always the same and stuff, because life changed, life went on and things of that nature and stuff, because it's a reintegration and one that's not always perfect and stuff. So it affects everybody on the ground level, because again, can't stress this one enough, for everybody who's watching and listening. Every person in a war is a person, regardless of whether you think that they're not a good person, bad person, whatever have you. They're still a person and stuff, and they're going to be affected by what they go through. Even the people who go, oh yeah, I'm fine. No, they're not.
They're not. Yeah. And and I guess the other thing is, they'll come home and it's really hard to reintegrate, because it's so hard to, either get a job or just kind of work in that society, because all the skill sets they have for fighting war, that can't really be reintegrated back in. Like if you were, say, in general infantry, if you were just a soldier fighting on the front lines, that can't really be applied anywhere, at least not in the way that people expect on the surface. So, it is really hard to kind of get back into society and regain some semblance of a normal life.
Yeah, it's pretty much, it varies, but also for folks who are probably more on the hyper fantastical, again, the broomsticks versus the toasters and stuff, they can still figure out a way of how things are and stuff, like, oh, the toaster is broken, it doesn't make bread very well anymore, it wants nothing to do with bread scares it too much and stuff. Or it's really just, it varies up. So yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as far as it does depend on the job as well. It does depend, because I know it's about the whole country and stuff like that. And well, we know after revelations that were made over the last decade or so following the Iraq War, attitudes are different now to war, because the mask kind of fell off. The internet kind of been the best tool for a government, but also the worst tool for a government. One sec. So there is this sorry, I've lost me train of thought. One sec. There you go, found it. Okay, so there's
That happens.
yeah, there's the way war has been broken down now in the eyes of the public is its origins is the modern day war organizations, the CIA and all that. And the origins of those organizations have now been fully uncovered and fleshed out, and it is now places on the internet filled with in-depth research on the start of these type of organizations, how it was the OSS, and then Truman was frightened of it because he realized it was more powerful than he was, and he was a lunatic. And then it morphed into a different beast called the CIA, and then from that the CIA needed a reform in between the the 50s and 70s. So they ended up going to Yale, and they ended up recruiting a lot of students from very specific clubs. In school clubs, England has the Bullington Club, but there was this one called, I think it was called the Skull and Bones Club, and it was all this. It was a fraternity that involved a lot of connected people whose fathers ran oil business oil. They were in the oil business, so they were used to spying on competitors, and the CIA's like new face, the OSS change, come from oil men and their children, who are all used to keeping secret in this in these fraternities, and so it's this web of nepotism that grew out, and one of the figures at the center of it all was George Bush Senior, HW, and that all goes into, you know, the struggle he had with Texas trying to recruit get the South to become more Republican leaning than they were Democrat, because the South used to be Democratic, like a proper Democratic Party safe haven, the South of America, in spite of, you know, a lot of things that part of the country was known for. It was only until like Kennedy was shot that they were Democrat leaning, and then after that it all changed. But me saying this is like kind of connecting oil to the long-term war machine. So now the public know that oil is kind of the lifeblood of all conflict. It's why America did so well in World War II. And because the general public know about that, it's now easier to suss out where conflicts are going to be and what the reasons behind the conflicts are for. So when somebody's coming back from war, it's always going to come up as a factor now. This, like, I won't call it cynicism because that sounds bad, but it's like more being in the know now. The general public know more about how war works. Like, they don't need to really do much research because it's such like a mimetic talking point now, with, you know, like the mission accomplished speech being false, like actually being a public lie, everyone being able to see through it. People whose families were away at war were still in Afghanistan and Iraq for years, and so yeah, the countries people go back to have changed now. And it's like the CIA reform I was talking about. The whole countries have had a reform because people are better educated thanks to the internet. So a lot of the stories you see where it's like the soldiers coming back from war and getting brought back into society and being praised, that's not like a realistic setting anymore. Like, it is in certain areas, closed off areas, but the majority of the public now know like war is it's a company profit making, it's a business venture. So that is obviously with the rise of the need for like electric cars and electric vehicles and this type of futuristic, as they say, framework that we're establishing for our country, there's not going to be any solid way of having a character be realistic in their like reaction to coming back home, because things are moving now and things are in flux now. So I'd say for the next 40 years or something like that, there's going to be this slow shift, but you're going to find pockets of that shift everywhere as like evidence of the shift. So if you're writing a character who's coming back and trying to integrate now, like, I think one of the things that they should be aware of is they should have a knowledge that it's temporary, or these times of peace are going to be like temporary, because we know now aggressive expansion with businesses doesn't stop. Like, even when the band snaps, it will break off and go somewhere else, because that's how capitalism works. So it's like, because the war is so tied to capitalism now, it always was, but now that we know that, there's now this effect with people having PTSD who don't even go to war.
So I really like the comparison of the post-war recovery with the Odyssey, because the reality is that the recovery lasts much, much longer than the actual war itself. I like to compare it sometimes to surgery. So for instance, even though the immediate danger happens during the surgery, once the surgery is done, then it's when the recovery starts, and the recovery can sometimes be individually even harder, and definitely much, much longer than the surgery itself. So just as a comparison, in Croatia, the post-war recovery lasted for years and had many, many effects. And in fact, it is still felt today. So, I mean, the things after war are different. If they're better is a very, very personal thing. And many people actually say that, you know, they never envisioned things ending up like this when they fought in the war themselves. And some of the things to consider are, for instance, like the amount of money and effort that is required to, you know, recover the country, for instance, from things like bombs and mines that are left in the affected, let's say, countryside and fertile fields, and even cities. So just as an example, the war in my country ended in 1995, and I think it was in 2020, we had 2 major earthquakes. So Children's Hospital in the main city was damaged. And during the war, actually, this children's hospital was hit in an attack on a city which was later declared a war crime. And it was attacked by sort of this explosive a device that breaks down into a smaller bombs. And one of these small bombs was found after 2020 still on hospital, even though, you know, the attack itself happened over, you know, decade earlier. It's almost 3 decades earlier that the attack happened, and some of these explosive devices still lingered on the roof of that children's hospital, even when I took my child into it, and without anyone knowing about it. And also, like when I was on the university, we drove into this one part of the country, and you know, we were just stopping for a short break. So a lot of us went out into a field, and then there was a local person suddenly stopping his car and started running outside of the car, and he just told everyone to freeze and to slowly step back the way they came, because apparently we walked into a mine suspected area, so into a suspected minefield. And that was, I think it was like 15 or maybe even 20 years after the war has ended. So, and there's still, up to this date, hundreds of thousands of mines which are still unexploded. So even though war ended, it will be soon 3 decades ago. So the recovery, it lasts a very, very long time. And it has many, many effects that, you know, people who just go into a different country to participate in war, they come back to a safe place, safe house. And they're often not familiar with these lingering effects, which continue and affect economy and affect development and affect next generations. And they just go on and on and on. And in fact, there is this whole show, Croatia, it's called Metastasis, which talks about, you know, kind of like war being sort of like cancer. You know, even though you can have a surgery and take this cancer out, there is always a danger of something, you know, lingering still there. And you always need to go do another checkup, because there could be metastasis, it could come back, and so on. So that's what really war recovery looks like.
So we were talking about the post-war recovery and its lingering effects and how it's portrayed in fiction. We're moving on now to not so much anything about the war itself, but the depiction of war in fiction and how it's changed over time. What misconceptions or tropes have lingered that need to be rethought, subverted, or abandoned altogether? So think in terms not so much of what happens to, I don't want to say take the emphasis off the real people in war, but when you're taking war and you're fictionalizing it, what are the themes, tropes, and entities that maybe are good, maybe need to be gotten rid of, maybe need to be tweaked, maybe need to be undercut? MultiMind, you're up.
For me, because I'm thinking of the movie Civil War, I think it's called, and stuff, and it reminded me of this war trope that I really despise so much, which this is very Western. Stop shoving white people in oppressed people's situations. Oh my God. Because it's like, for example, Civil War, I haven't seen the movie, but I'm aware of the premise. It's basically January 6th and stuff, but just put with war, like they just made it Hollywood. And it was very white. Like, people, people of different backgrounds are involved in war. Usually we're the targets at it, but definitely it's just that the idea of like, oh, the blonde hair, blue eyed oppressed person is like, bro, I mean, this is it's just that when it almost starts to sound almost as if it is a propaganda in itself of it happens to them, the people we already don't like as a society. Imagine if it happened to you. That's not cool. That's very dehumanizing, actually. So yeah, that, and also you see it all the time, like for example in video games like Modern Warfare, Call of Duty and stuff. War is depicted as this super awesome, super masculine thing and stuff. Call of Duty doesn't show you how PTS works, how PTSD works. And it's really just, it's not just all thunder, lightning, and cool toys and bulky up male power fantasy guys walking around, a la Arnold Schwarzenegger and so on and so forth. Like that could, yeah, up the diversity in war, because at least the war will make more sense. And unless it's again broomsticks and toasters, even there's still different types of toasters and still different types of broomsticks. But definitely, yeah.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, well, I was going to touch on the broomsticks and toaster side of things. Not literally, fortunately. Yeah, so writing a lot in the fantasy genre, where, or just anything speculative, where you're throwing new tools of war into the play. I think the main thing is a lot of the time writers forget to apply the same evolution of tactics and strategy to their fantasy elements as they do to the rest of their warfare. So you'll have, let's say, it's a dragon warfare kind of book, right? Where you've got a whole armies, and the armies have some guys on dragons, riding the dragons, doing the dragon things with that. That's cool. The army rank and files, they have all the logistics applied to them. They still need to have tactics. They still need to train. They still need to march. But then the people with the dragons always seem to be just entirely removed from that. They don't have any kind of fighting formation. They don't have any kind of real institutionalized training. And sometimes if they do, it's often stuff that comes down to rituals, or just, just like, oh, I got a dragon. The dragon does the stuff for me, right? I think, yeah, making sure you... Yeah, well, I mean, that's it, right? Like, you got to come in and just make sure that you are applying that the same level of realism as you do to the dragons as you do to the soldiers. I mean, if you're not applying any realism to the soldiers in the first place, then you don't have to do that to the dragons. But often I see that mismatch between those two massive powers. Like, and then, that also extends to, you've got people using magic in the ranks of battle, and suddenly they're just so much more massively overpowered and don't have any of the rules applying to them. But I think I'd really like to see a lot of the rules of warfare, a lot of the rules of just logistics and upkeep applied to those fantastical elements.
That, and also people do freeze. They may say never mention those times when they freeze in war, but people do freeze. People do stand there and go, what did I get myself into? And things of that nature. So that I always like anything that shows the shock of the not shock value, but the shock of they're like, wait, this is not what I was expecting and stuff.
Yeah, they're
Because
still human at the end of the day, right? Like that
yeah,
you need to keep applying those human elements to those aspects. Unless, you know, it
yeah.
is just dragons, unless they don't have anyone riding it, unless you're just sending a dragon into battle,
Even a
then just do
dragon would
whatever.
sit here and go, why am I doing this?
Yeah, exactly. They haven't promised me a hoard of gold.
Yeah, and they're like, I don't think I care for gold anymore.
Yeah, this is awful.
Mhm.
I do have like one of the things I like to narrow in on is like tropes in fiction. Like we haven't really mentioned a lot of specific like modern war books because a lot of there's not really that many that cross like top 10 lists. A lot of them are like dad fiction where it's like specific soldiers doing specific things,
A
and
lot
it's
of
always
The Chris
framed as
Ryan
the
stuff,
way.
SAS kind of stuff.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's always framed as like one man who can do the job. That's not a good one because again, war isn't fought by one person. Otherwise, they'd be a superhero or a supervillain. But there's one of the things you've mentioned Civil War there. That does one of the things I was that is absolutely like great on my nerves. Color, color theory in film and television and any visual media. The the blatant reuse of the colors red and blue, that is something that I wish people did less of, because then it not only creates a narrative that is obvious in a story, so in especially a story like a story with supposed mysteries, but then people making the thing like try and have this faux professional. Oh no, we're not judging. We're not. This is told from both sides. You don't know who the sides are. Meanwhile, there's a soldier there intimidating someone wearing a pair of red sunglasses. I think he's a Republican. He's wearing a pair of red sunglasses. So like I'm being lied to by the creator. I don't like that. Um, the best source to look at, like the best tropes used, is anime, because anime comes from a country that is kind of anti-war. It's probably the best
Um,
thing a country's done is sign article 8
yes,
and all
yes.
that. And they have a flashback system that they use to reiterate details over and over again, so you never forget anything. Follow anime tropes if you want to tell a ethical war story, if that makes sense. Like at least a war story that's a bit more truthful.
I was going to say you don't have to worry
Like,
about color theory for me because I only use the color orange.
oh really? That's no, thank you so much.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, because I've been on a thing with that with the red and blues, because it used to be like the tropes in films and the fiction used to be focused on the clothing. So it used to be the headscarves. I don't know the technical term for them, versus t-shirts and Oakleys. That so it was
And
like
that's a lot
uniforms.
red and blue. I mean,
Well,
honestly,
yeah.
but for me, I would think Bloods and Crips and stuff, but also it's
Well,
just
yeah.
Yeah.
it's really also because I mean, there's books about modern warfare. They're most likely written by people of color because guess who gets to deal with that? But
Yeah.
definitely, it's really because March is one, and that's a graphic novel about the civil rights movement and so on and so forth.
hmm
We Were Called the Enemy by George Takei, about when they were in internment camps for Japanese Americans, 1989. For in China about the Tiananmen massacre, Tiananmen Square massacre. Like I could go on and on and on and on and on. Even Barefoot Jen with Japan and stuff, and also like they're
Oh,
not really
yeah.
that anti-war, because if you think they're anti-war, ask Korea and Indonesia.
Well, this is the thing. Yeah, I actually I did get into a debate with a Korean American over that type of subject, and that was kind of why I like Article 8 so much, because it killed the war um out of shame, which I did admire. I do think like every country should have its own version of dialing back warfare, and I know it was a punishment, but the last country to get such a severe punishment and ostracized by the Western like parts of Europe was Germany in the 1930s, and they caused World War II over that resentment, whereas Japan didn't. They went the opposite way and has kind of become uh, America, it serves America a little bit because America established itself as like a Stalin-esque figure now, where it went into the administration building, or the UN, and rewrote all the rules after helping Europe a tiny bit in the war. It fought Japan. Yes, it was a big thing, but it also unnecessarily dropped the nukes to make a statement, and that was a Stalin-esque move where it took over America seems to have taken over the entire UN and now has complete control and veto power. And now Japan, the last pro-war politician they had was shot, which I'm not saying that's good. I'm not, but I'm also saying that is the
That can also
reaction.
be used as a dynamic in stories of also like the
Yeah.
outcomes of how things are in works, about when you might be considered the good guy at the time, but later on as time happens, pretty much it's just that you see how sentiments change. And also, I mean, somebody's pro-war and the gun gets got by a homemade gun. That's pretty,
Yeah.
that's a
The device, as it was called.
definitely
Yeah.
when it comes to issues in fiction and stuff, it's like that can be always a dynamic of also showing how time has changed and stuff, which I don't think it's explored enough in war, because it's almost like war's
Yeah.
over, we all go home. But I think
Yeah.
that should definitely show up more in media, and especially in fiction, about how time changes and so do people's ideas, opinions, feelings, and everything.
Yeah, it's like just to play off Liam's last point there, like basically those people who were the main people of the war, like it's not like that they haven't stopped being the hero, they're just no longer useful for what's currently going on.
And also how that might
Yeah.
make them feel about themselves, and also how much it
Mm.
might apply to what they feel about, like they may at first when they came home going, yeah, this is great, but later on they're like, what did I do, or things of that nature. So I think that like that's also a misconception that the great warrior, you know, the Captain America type and stuff, and it's like, no, you do have times where, you know, the moment's quiet and you're just, and all you can hear is just all the messed up stuff you did back there that you can't exactly escape. I don't get to see basically in when it comes to war media, one, it's really, really super white. It's got to stop doing that one. But it's also, it's just the more realistic aspects of war, as well as the warrior, the soldier, and how they try to deal with it. And it's not always rah rah. Sometimes it's just you can't handle going to the supermarket and somebody opening a soda can right beside you. Like little things like that that folks may think don't really mean a lot, but actually means quite a bit. Because also it shows I think for me is a useful dynamic in showing how the war changed the world, yeah, in the story, but also how it changes a world of inside a person, because they might be crawling on the floor, crying, sobbing, thinking they're back in the trenches.
To go off that point, actually, the one of the things like you were talking about then is you were talking about, like, you know, the soda can thing, and that reminded me of another really quick point, if I may. The PTSD tropes in fiction tend to be bigger than, you know, there's a broad range of them, like smaller ones, like somebody just happen to buy a comfort animal, like they don't know it's a comfort animal, but they need an animal in their life type thing. That was one of the things I wrote into my novel, where it is there's an animal who runs around the house, and it's a very like it's a very like specific. It's a hamster that wears a bell that's toilet trained. It's a very strange thing, but it's there to stand out to the reader. And then it's only in chapter 4 when you see one of the characters holding it on where, and then the breathing changes and the breathing starts to go disjointed, because they're recapping like a story from when their time in war, and they just stroke it, and they stroke the animal and it comforts them, and it kind of evaporates the panic a little bit. So I think like not every not every attack or like PTSD episode needs to be somebody like hiding in
Yeah,
the corner, like having a complete panic breakdown, like because what is it? It's like kind of on a spectrum, isn't it?
for me, because I actually do have CPTSD and actually do have two traumas sort of stacked on top of each other, so I can talk about this. But definitely, yeah, trauma, even in my book, it discusses trauma, yay, but doesn't have anything about war. It's all about music and rock. But definitely, it's really just that trauma shows up in really quiet ways. And that's the one thing I feel like a lot of people don't tend to notice, is that trauma is quiet. It's not, I wish it were the big, hey, this is what's wrong with you, because that would be so nice. But definitely it's small. It's the little things that start to mess with you. You don't want to be by yourself. You're really noticing exits. You know, your eyes dart around a bit. Sometimes you know, you're not sure what is and what isn't and stuff. Like the smaller ways of showing trauma just kind of dripping in, and people don't know they're traumatized and stuff until way after. Usually others notice it first and stuff. So it's really, it might be the soda can that might set them off, but also it can be just the fact that they're really kind of just touchy about just being in a supermarket. So maybe they only want to go the nanosecond the market opens because there is nobody there and stuff. They know, okay, I'm the first person in, nothing can go wrong, so on and so forth. Or maybe they might start doom scrolling and stuff about learning about like, oh, like mass shootings, this, that, and third, violent things that they weren't interested in previously, but it gives them that comfort in their brain of, it helps the brain fix and feel about what they went through. Because that trauma, when it's unchecked, it just shows itself in really weird and odd ways.
Yeah, it's
like,
about kind of getting control, right?
Yeah, because they may avoid a particular fruit because it reminds them of a particular thing. Like they might have seen a fruit stall in the country they were in and it was just falling down, and that's all their brain subconsciously hooked onto, and now they don't like oranges and apples or things of that nature or something of that nature. Trauma always sneaks itself in, speaking from experience. Trauma usually, and that for me, I notice when I don't see a lot of that in the stories. It's usually like the person that goes nuts. But no, that's not true. It's usually they have to build up to it and so on and so forth, because the average person isn't going nutty and like out in the street or stuff. And a lot of people have trauma disorders. A lot of people have, and it's more than war can give you PTSD. You can have war-like conditions, but anything can give you PTSD. So yeah, trauma moves very quiet. And that I would like to see more in media instead of personal. They were traumatized. No, they watch certain shows. Now they have certain behaviors. It slips in.
Yeah, without getting too deep into it, I'm just going to agree real quick. Like, yeah, trauma can be very quiet. For me, it manifests a lot of times in trying to regulate my own schedule very much. And my experience is not war related, but yeah, I like to manage my things as closely as I can, and I get a little irked when things don't go according to the plan because the plan is the safe thing. And I like to have fallbacks that are safe. Like for me, if I'm hungry and I really can't think of anything to eat, I'll eat a Lunchable, because even though there's lead in the Lunchables pizzas now, apparently, we're not going to get into that. It's a comfort food for me. It always has been since I was in middle school. So it's just one of those things. Anyway,
and it's like that type of dynamic can really like make a very good and connecting character.
Yes.
Yeah. And really, I would love to see that a lot more. Like I'm not a big fan of Marvel movies, but I did appreciate how they had handled Iron Man and how he was in his suit, how trauma affected him versus, say, you know, Captain America, who's an actual trained soldier. Tony Stark is not, and stuff. So I thought that was very good at how they show how trauma affects different people differently.
So aside from the things which were already mentioned, one trope which I think should stop being used in general is glorification of war crimes and, you know, like mass destruction and mass murder as something good. And this is something that I often see in fantasy. Well, not so much in science fiction, but oftentimes in fantasy, especially in those stories which like to focus on, you know, like gray or characters or villains. And I think this is actually a very bad thing. I mean, it's okay to write about villains, but if you do, please do not glorify war crimes, because like MultiMind said, you know, in any sort of conflict, in any sort of war, every single person participating in it is still a person.
Right. So we're moving on to the wrap up area. And this is where I like to always ask for a positive tip and a negative tip. So let's start with positive. What is one important tip? And try to make this as quick and dense as we can that you would give anyone, especially a beginner, who's planning to write a story about war or conflict. This can be a resource to check out. This could be just some critical advice. This is the sort of thing that if, like, I've written stories about wars, and I wish I knew things 20 years ago when I was writing them that I didn't know then that now I might know. What is your thing that you would give to your past self or somebody else and say, hey, get this one thing right?
The one thing I would say is that war affects everybody. It affects everybody differently. It affects men differently, women differently, everything. There's so many things in there. But also look at things like Dangerous Speech Project, because it really shows up how things can lead up to war, because it doesn't start overnight. And Human Rights Watch is great because they have nothing but information about it. And museums exist. Look at them, especially virtual ones.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I'd say personally for myself, if you can stomach it, if you're able to do it, get yourself down to your local paintball field and have a go at paintball for the day, because that'll give you a really sudden and exhausting idea of the sheer physicality that goes into like fighting in a little battle. Like obviously it's nowhere near the real thing because you're not actually in mortal danger, but trying to go from a full sprint to trying to make sure you're accurately shooting your paintball marker is really hard. You're out of breath the entire time. You're covered in mud the entire time. It just gives you a really kind of close look at how exhausting it is to try and keep yourself active for so long in a day like that.
Okay, for fiction, watch My Hero Academia, Naruto Shippuden, and Attack on Titan. They're really easily digestible, and they contain every trope, and they help get the story across to you really well. And they are really good learning resources on how to write ethical conflicts and even ethical stories in general. Non-fiction, check out the Blowback podcast and the works of Matt Christman. That's it.
So one thing that you should do in any sort of fictional story talking about war is, I think, you should either talk to the people who have experienced it, or do a very, very thorough research. And actually, most of the books that I mentioned, for instance, like Joe Haldeman, Forever War, he had an experience in war. Susanna Collins, with the Hunger Games, she didn't have experience herself, but her father was actually fighting in 2 wars, including Vietnam War. And so, and I also found like in interviews where she said that there was a lot of effect of her father's stories on the way she wrote Hunger Games, and one can really sort of like feel this effect, especially through this ending and this sort of the effect that was seen in the Hunger Games on everyone in the society. So, and also like Leo Tolstoy, he had a conversation with many different people who were fighting in the war. So this is one thing that you should do.
Alrighty, and then the other side of that thing. What is one thing? It could be a trope, it could be a stylistic thing, it could be a perspective thing that you would caution writers to avoid at pretty much any cost when they're writing a story about war. So what is the one thing, like, hey, don't do this thing because it's a really bad idea?
Dehumanization. Everybody who is in the war, even if it's a case of broomsticks versus toasters and stuff, that's humanizing, but everybody there is a human in stuff. So don't dehumanize the other side, because at that point, you're just writing propaganda. Don't write propaganda. Write better shit.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. Like, don't write thinly veiled metaphors for something that is just on the nose or just offensive like that. There's just no point. There's plenty of that crap in the world. Write something interesting.
Try to avoid self-insert characters. Keep yourself separate, and also don't pretend not to choose a side, because you will.
One thing that you shouldn't do is write a story where, you know, war has absolutely no consequences. Like, you know, everything ends in fireworks and that's it. Everyone is happy, end of the story. Because I'm not going to go into details because what everyone else said is true. Just war is very complicated. It has a lot of effects. And you should not write war without any consequences, without any deaths, without any lingering trauma, and so on.
All right. Thank you all so much for your time, for all the effort, because I know this is a panel that requires a lot of thought on some negative topics, and it's really intense and difficult. So thank you all for being here, panelists. Thank you all viewers for being here. And one last time, everyone go around and just let people know where they can find your work. And yeah, self-promotion time.
All right. Well, you can find my work anywhere that books, ebooks, and audiobooks are sold. As you can see, my most latest book, The Glassman, which has nothing to do with war at all under any circumstances. It's just music and rock and roll and a little bit of glass. And so pretty much you can find me, however, on multimindpublishing.com, as well as I'm on different social medias, but I notice I hang around Instagram quite a bit. So MultiMind Publishing on Instagram, and definitely, yeah, like I said, anywhere that my books, ebooks are sold, and also audiobooks. And the audiobook for this will be coming out at the end of the summer.
Nice. Yeah, so you can find my books online. You can search for me at Jonathan Weiss. My Instagram handle is JonathanW_author. That's where I'm usually most active. And, you know, jump into my books in the Flux Catastrophe series there. It's about a mutiny aboard a walking fortress of scrap metal, set in a world that's like Mad Max with magic. So plenty of warfare stuff in there, plenty of trauma following that because everything goes horribly, as it usually does.
If you want to find me, go on a website called Vero, or a social media app called Vero. That's my main one, or just look for my name, Liam Quane, on Instagram or again Facebook if you're older than 70. And for my debut novel is called Road to Juno. That is a story about set in the post World War III New York City that's in the middle of rebuilding itself, and follows a family of super-powered beings who go to war with a cosmic god. And that is available where any books are sold, like Amazon. It's kind of tropey to name all the obvious ones, but you know it's on the obvious ones: Waterstones, Barnes and Noble. And I've got a new short story coming out soon, and it is directly about, you know, a commentary on desert conflict and small village conflict. And that'll be coming out. I think it should be out by the time this airs. So if anyone wants to check that out, it'll be brand new, and it might be fun. Enjoy.
Well, friends, that concludes our panel, War and Its Long-Term Effects in Fiction. We here at WriteHive deeply appreciate you coming and checking this out, and we encourage you to check out all the other wonderful events we have going on this weekend, including the ones from the previous conferences that I mentioned at the start of the video. Please be aware that WriteHive does have a year-round Discord that hosts events and projects such as our weekly weekend write-ins and the Word Nerd Cafe. We'd love to have you swing by and talk writing, whether you're a new writer seeking advice or an experienced one with some to share. Thank you all and have a great day. Bye-bye.